On a Tuesday morning in March of 2003, every serious sheep producer in Fillmore County, Minnesota, knew exactly what a Cull Ewe was worth. Not much. Maybe $20 at the sale barn if you were lucky, maybe nothing at all if the buyers were thin that day, and sometimes the hauling cost more than the check. A Cull Ewe was a ewe that had failed at the one job a ewe is supposed to do, which is raise a lamb, and sometimes two, and sometimes three, and do it again the following year without complaint. She was too old, or too small, or too prone to mastitis, or too slow to claim her lambs, or simply not profitable enough to justify another winter of hay. She was the animal that the experienced men sorted to the back pen, and the experienced men were never wrong about which animals belonged there. In Fillmore County in 2003, sheep were not a romantic enterprise. They were a practical one. The county had been running sheep on its limestone ridges and creek-bottom pastures for 4 generations, ever since German and Norwegian settlers figured out that the land that was too rough for corn and too thin for soybeans could still grow grass, and grass could still grow wool, and wool could still grow money if you managed it carefully enough. The operations were not large by national standards. Most ran between 80 and 200 ewes on family ground that had been paid for twice over, once by the grandfather and once by the father, and the sons were paying for it a third time in the form of operating loans that the local bank renewed each spring without much ceremony, because everyone understood that this was simply how it worked. The men who ran these flocks knew their animals the way they knew their own children, by face and by temperament, and by the specific sound each one made at feeding time, and they were proud of that knowledge in the quiet way that people are proud of things they have never had to explain to anyone. This is the world that Nora Lindgren was born into. Her father, Gunnar Lindgren, ran 140 ewes on 320 acres of mixed pasture and hay ground northeast of Harmony, Minnesota, on a farm his own father had broken from timber in the 1940s. Gunnar was a methodical man. He lambed in February, which was cold and miserable, and required him to be in the barn at 2 in the morning more nights than not. But he had always lambed in February, and his father had always lambed in February, and the lambs were ready for the spring grass when the spring grass arrived, and that was the logic of it. He ran Rambouillet crosses because Rambouillet crosses were what Fillmore County ran. Fine wool animals with good mothering instincts and solid fleeces that the wool pool bought at a predictable price every June. His average weaning weight ran around 85 pounds. His average fleece weight ran around 8.5 pounds. His net return per ewe, in a good year, was somewhere between $40 and $60 after feed, health costs, and the depreciation on equipment that was older than his children. He was not getting rich. He was not trying to get rich. He was maintaining something, and he understood the difference. Nora grew up doing the things that children on sheep farms do. She tagged lambs and drenched ewes and learned to read the signs of pneumonia before a veterinarian could confirm it. She learned which ewes were reliable mothers and which ones needed to be penned with their lambs for an extra day before they bonded properly. She learned the smell of a barn in February at 2 in the morning, which is a smell that stays with you for the rest of your life, whether you want it to or not. She was good at all of it. She was not, in those years, particularly curious about whether any of it could be done differently. Different was not a concept that had much purchase in Fillmore County's sheep culture. Different was what people tried when they didn't know what they were doing, and Gunnar Lindgren's daughter knew what she was doing. She left for the University of Minnesota in the fall of 2001. She was 18 years old, and she intended to study agricultural business because agricultural business was practical, and practical was what her father respected. She took the required courses in her first year and did well in them, and then, in the second semester of her freshman year, she enrolled in an introductory animal science course taught by a professor named Dr. Anita Saarinen, who had spent 12 years studying small ruminant production systems in New Zealand, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands before returning to Minnesota to teach, and who had opinions about Midwestern sheep production that she did not keep to herself. Let me tell you about Dr. Saarinen because she is the reason Nora Lindgren started asking questions that nobody in Fillmore County had thought to ask. Dr. Saarinen was not a provocateur. She was not interested in tearing down what worked. But she had spent a decade watching sheep operations in other countries produce 2 and 3 times the net return per ewe that American Midwestern producers were achieving, and she had a very specific theory about why, and that theory had to do with genetics. Not genetics in the abstract, theoretical sense, but genetics in the concrete, measurable, dollars per acre sense. The Rambouillet cross that dominated Fillmore County was a fine wool animal bred for clip weight and hardiness in arid western range conditions. It was not bred for prolificacy, which is a technical term for the tendency to produce multiple lambs per birth, and it was not bred for out-of-season breeding, which is the tendency to cycle and conceive outside the traditional fall breeding window. Dr. Saarinen had data from New Zealand Romney and Finnish landrace crossbreeding programs showing that producers who incorporated high prolificacy genetics into their flocks could increase their average lambs weaned per ewe from the Midwestern standard of 1.2 to somewhere between 1.8 and 2.1, and that this single change, properly managed, could more than double the net return per ewe without a proportional increase in feed costs because the marginal cost of raising a second lamb on a ewe already consuming maintenance ration was substantially lower than the cost of maintaining an additional ewe. Nora sat in that lecture and felt something shift inside her. Not dramatically, not like a light coming on, more like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known existed, and the room was full of numbers that didn't match the numbers she had grown up with. She started reading. She read the New Zealand Sheep and Beef Farm Survey data going back 15 years. She read Finnish landrace breed studies from Iowa State and Cornell. She read the polypay development research from the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in Dubois, Idaho, where researchers had spent 30 years breeding specifically for prolificacy and out-of-season lambing in continental American conditions. She read about the Romanov, a Russian breed with a prolificacy rate so extreme that litters of 4 and 5 lambs were not uncommon, and about the practical challenges of managing those litter sizes in a small operation. She filled a spiral notebook with figures, and then she filled a second one. By the end of her sophomore year, she had a theory, and the theory was this. Fillmore County sheep producers were leaving somewhere between $40 and $80 per ewe on the table every single year because they were running genetics optimized for a production system that bore no resemblance to their actual conditions, and nobody had noticed because everybody was doing the same thing, and when everybody does the same thing, the losses are invisible. She went home for the summer after her sophomore year with the notebooks and a plan. She waited until a Sunday evening in June, after supper, when her father was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and not yet ready to go back to the barn. Her mother, Ingrid, was washing dishes at the sink. Nora put the notebooks on the table, and she told her father what she had learned. Let me tell you about that kitchen table conversation, because it is the hinge that this whole story turns on. Gunnar Lindgren listened. He was a man who listened before he spoke, which was one of the things Nora had always respected about him. He looked at the notebooks. He looked at the yield comparisons. He looked at the prolificacy data from the polypay trials. He looked at the per-ewe revenue projections that Nora had built using his own cost structure, which she knew from years of watching him do the books at that same table. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Our ewes lamb fine. We don't lose many." Nora said, "We don't lose many, but we also don't gain many. We're averaging 1.18 lambs weaned per ewe. The polypay data shows 1.87 in comparable conditions. That's 69 extra lambs on your 140 ewes. At current market weight and price, that's close to $8,000 in additional gross revenue on the same land, the same feed, the same barn." Gunnar looked at the number for a moment. He said, "I need to think about it." Ingrid, at the sink, did not turn around, but she said quietly, "She's right, you know." And Gunnar picked up his coffee cup, and he did not say anything else that evening. What he said, 2 weeks later, was this: "You can have the back 40 acres of the roughest, stoniest pasture on the Lindgren farm. The ground that had always been used for the dry ewes nobody expected much from." He told her she could run whatever she wanted on it, up to 30 head, and that he would not interfere, and that if it worked he would consider it, and if it didn't work they would not speak of it again. It was not an enthusiastic endorsement, but it was permission, and Nora understood that in Gunnar Lindgren's vocabulary, permission was a form of trust. Now let me tell you about the sale barn in Harmony, Minnesota, on a Saturday morning in August of 2003, because that is where this story gets its legs. Nora had driven to every sheep operation within 40 miles that summer, looking for polypay or polypay cross ewes she could afford on a college student's budget, which was essentially no budget at all. She had found a few, bought 3 young ewes at reasonable prices, and was at the sale barn looking for more when the cull pen came through. There were 11 ewes in the cull pen that morning, sorted animals from 4 different farms, ranging from genuinely broken down to merely unfashionable, and the buyers moved through them quickly because there was not much to argue about. The last animal in the pen was a 4-year-old ewe that the consignment slip identified only as a polypay cross, origin unknown, reason for cull listed as poor producer. She was thin. Her left ear had a healed tear in it from an old fence injury. She stood at the back of the pen with the particular stillness of an animal that has learned not to expect much. The auctioneer started her at $30, and the room went quiet. He dropped to $25. Still quiet, he dropped to $20. One hand went up. It was Nora's. She loaded the ewe into the back of her father's truck and drove home. She named the ewe Burka, after a Viking trading post she had read about in a history class, because she had a feeling about her, and she wanted to give the feeling a name. The feeling turned out to be justified. Burka was thin because she had been managed badly, not because she was constitutionally weak. On good pasture and proper nutrition, she recovered her condition within 6 weeks. In November, when Nora put her in with the ram she had borrowed from a polypay producer 2 counties over, Burka settled immediately. In February, she delivered triplets, all 3 of them vigorous, all 3 of them claimed within minutes of birth. She raised all 3 to weaning at weights that made Nora write the numbers down twice, because she wanted to be sure she had them right. 94 pounds, 91 pounds, and 88 pounds. 3 lambs, 1 ewe, 1 breeding season. Gunner watched this from the other side of the fence and said nothing. Let me tell you about Denny Crowley, because you need to understand him before you can understand what he said at the Fillmore County Sheep Producers Meeting in October of 2003. Denny ran the largest sheep operation in the county, 280 ewes on 600 acres south of Preston, and he was the kind of man who had built something real and knew it and did not feel the need to be modest about it. He had served on the State Wool Pool Board for 9 years. He had been named Minnesota Sheep Producer of the Year in 1998. He drove a truck that was 3 years old instead of 12, which in Fillmore County was a statement. He was 54 years old, and he had been raising Rambouillet crosses since he was 19, and he had the records to prove that his system worked, and his system was the county's system, and the county's system was, in his view, the correct system. The Fillmore County Sheep Producers met 4 times a year in the basement of the Lutheran Church in Harmony. There were usually between 20 and 30 producers at these meetings, men mostly, ranging from Denny Crowley's scale down to operations of 40 or 50 ewes that were more hobby than enterprise. Nora had been attending since she was 14, first as Gunner's daughter, and now, in the fall of 2003, as a producer in her own right, which was a status that nobody at the meeting had formally acknowledged, but which she had claimed by showing up with a notebook and sitting in a chair rather than standing against the wall. She waited until the business portion of the meeting was finished, and then she raised her hand and asked if she could say something about alternative genetics. The room did not go hostile. It went something more uncomfortable than hostile, which was politely indifferent, the way a room goes when it has already decided that what is about to be said does not require full attention. She laid out the data. She talked about prolificacy rates and lambs weaned per ewe, and the polypay trial results, and the per ewe revenue differential. She talked about her own summer results, which were preliminary but directionally clear. She talked about Burka's triplets. The silence lasted about 2 seconds. Then Denny Crowley started laughing. It was not a cruel laugh. That is important to say. It was the laugh of a man who has heard something that strikes him as genuinely, almost affectionately, naive. The laugh of someone who has been around long enough to recognize a college student's first encounter with a textbook as distinct from 20 years of actual production experience. He said, "Honey, I've seen those polypay numbers. They look great on paper. You know what they don't account for? Dystocia, milk capacity, ewe mortality from triplet stress. You raise triplets, you lose ewes. You lose ewes, you lose money. We run the genetics we run because they work in this climate, on this ground, in this market." He looked around the room for confirmation and found it in the nodding of a dozen heads. He said, "Come back and talk to us when you've got more than 1 ewe and a summer's worth of data." The room moved on to the next item on the agenda. Nora drove home that night without saying much. Ingrid asked how the meeting went. Nora said, "Fine." Gunner looked up from his paper and then looked back down at it. That night, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her notebooks and she wrote down what Denny Crowley had said, word for word, as best she could remember it, in the margin of the page where she kept her prolificacy projections. She underlined it. She did not know yet exactly why she was doing that. She would know later. Let me tell you about the science, because Denny Crowley's objections were not stupid, and they deserve a real answer. And the real answer is what Nora had spent 2 years building. The dystocia concern was legitimate for Romanov crosses, which could produce litters of 4 and 5 that genuinely exceeded a ewe's physical capacity. The Polypay had been specifically bred to address this. The Polypay was developed at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station by crossing Rambouillet, Targhee, Dorset, and Finn landrace, and the explicit breeding objective was prolificacy without dystocia, meaning multiple births at manageable individual birth weights. The station data showed average birth weights for Polypay triplets in the 7.5 to 9.5 pound range, which is within the range that a well-conditioned ewe can deliver without assistance in the large majority of cases. The milk capacity concern was also real, but it was a management problem, not a genetic problem. A ewe carrying triplets required supplemental creep feeding for the third lamb, which added cost, but that cost, when modeled against the additional market weight at weaning, was net positive by an average of $31 per triplet set in the Iowa State trial data. The ewe mortality concern was the one that Nora had spent the most time on, because it was the one that could actually sink the economics. What she found was that triplet-related ewe mortality in well-managed Polypay operations ran about 2.1% above the single lamb baseline, which at her projected scale added roughly 0.6 ewe deaths per year against an additional revenue of somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 annually. The math was not close. What Denny Crowley had was experience with a system. What Nora had was data about a different system. Those are not the same argument, and the fact that they are not the same argument is the thing that the room in the Lutheran church basement had not understood. Nora went back to school that fall, and she worked, and she came home the following summer, and she worked, and the flock on the back 40 grew as she could afford to grow it. She bought animals carefully, prioritizing documented prolificacy records over price, and she culled without sentiment, which was something she had learned from her father, even if she was applying it to a different standard. By the spring of 2005, she had 22 ewes on the back 40, all Polypay or Polypay crosses, all managed on a nutritional program she had designed around the specific energy demands of multiple barren ewes in the Minnesota winter, which required higher pre-lambing supplementation than the Rambouillet program her father ran, but which she had costed out to the dollar. She graduated from the University of Minnesota in May of 2005 with a degree in agricultural business and a minor in animal science and a second spiral notebook that was more worn than the first. Let me tell you about the lambing season of 2005, because it was the first full season on the back 40 that produced numbers large enough to mean something. Nora lambed in March, not February, which was the first departure from county practice that anyone had noticed. She lambed in March because the Polypay's breeding flexibility allowed her to target a March lambing, and because March lambing in Minnesota, while still cold, is cold in a different way than February, a way that allows a few more degrees of margin for newborn lambs and reduces the incidence of hypothermia in the first critical hours of life. She had 22 ewes go through the breeding season. She got 22 pregnancies. She got 41 live lambs, which is a lambing rate of 1.86 against her father's 1.19 that same spring. She lost 2 lambs in the first 48 hours to causes she documented carefully. 1 hypothermia, 1 failure of passive transfer, and she made notes about what she would do differently the following year. She weaned 39 lambs. Average weaning weight, 88 pounds. Total weaned weight, 3,432 pounds. At the going market price that summer, her gross revenue from 22 ewes was $7,106. Her father's gross revenue from 140 ewes, at his average performance, was approximately $26,000. Per EWA, Nora's return was $323. Her father's was $186. She showed him the numbers at the kitchen table that August. He looked at them for a long time. He said, "Your feed costs are higher." She said, "I know. I've accounted for them. Net per ewe, I'm at $241. You're at $143. He looked at the numbers again. He said, "You had a good year." She said, "I had a normal year. The data says this should be a normal year." He picked up his coffee cup. He said, "Let me think about it." That fall, at the Fillmore County Sheep Producers Meeting, Nora presented her 2005 results. She did not editorialize. She put the numbers on a piece of paper and she passed the paper around the room and she let the numbers do what numbers do. Denny Crowley looked at the paper. He said, "1 season." She said, "Yes." He said, "You had good weather." She said, "February was the same for both of us." He said, "Your scale is too small to draw conclusions." She said, "I agree. That's why I'm going to do it again." He handed the paper to the man next to him and he looked at Nora with an expression that was not quite the laugh from 2 years earlier, but was related to it, a smaller version of the same dismissal, and he said, "You're a determined young woman. I'll give you that." The room moved on. Let me tell you about the summer of 2006, because it is the year that the back 40 stopped being an experiment and started being an argument. Nora had expanded to 31 ewes. She had refined her pre-lambing nutrition protocol based on the previous year's data. She had added a small creep feeding area that reduced her triplet rearing labor by about 2 hours per day during peak lambing. Her lambing rate that spring was 1.91. She weaned 57 lambs. Her net return per ewe was $268. She was now running 22% of her father's ewe numbers and generating 36% of his net revenue. Gunner did not say much about this directly, but in July he told her that if she wanted to take on the south pasture, the 80-acre field along the creek that had always been his best ground, she could run it as she saw fit. He said it the way he said most things, briefly and without ceremony, and Nora said thank you and did not make more of it than he intended. People in the county were starting to drive past the back 40 and the south pasture slowly, not stopping, just slowing down. The lambs on Nora's ground were visibly heavier than the lambs on the neighboring operations, and there were more of them per ewe, and these were things that a Fillmore County sheep producer could not help noticing, even if he was not ready to say anything about them. At the co-op in Harmony, Denny Crowley was still holding court at the counter on Tuesday mornings, and the word was that he had looked into polypay genetics and found them wanting for reasons he was prepared to enumerate at length. And the men at the counter listened because Denny Crowley had been right about enough things for long enough that his certainty was its own kind of evidence. Nora was aware of this. She was not particularly bothered by it. She had the numbers, and the numbers were not going anywhere. Then came the summer of 2007, which was the year that answered every remaining question. Let me tell you about the summer of 2007, because it is the reason this story is still being told. The summer of 2007 brought a drought to southeastern Minnesota that the older farmers said was the worst since 1988. It came early, in May, and it stayed through August, and it did not come the way droughts sometimes come, gradually, giving you time to adjust. It came fast, and it came complete. Pastures that were green in the first week of May were brown and brittle by the first week of June. The creek along the south pasture dropped to a trickle by July. Hay prices doubled by August because everyone needed hay, and nobody had enough of it, and the operations that had been running on tight margins found themselves running on no margins at all, and the operations that had been running on no margins found themselves making decisions about which animals to sell and how quickly. Denny Crowley sold 80 ewes in July. He had to. His pastures were gone, and his hay reserves were not sufficient to carry 280 ewes through what looked like a long dry fall, and the economics of buying hay at drought prices to maintain a full flock were not recoverable in a single season. He sold good ewes, productive ewes that had taken years to select and develop, and he sold them at distressed prices because everyone else was selling at the same time and the market knew it. He sold them at an average of $85 per head, which was $40 below what they would have brought in a normal year, and the loss on those 80 animals, between the sale discount and the foregone production, was somewhere north of $15,000. Nora did not sell a single ewe. She did not sell a single ewe because she'd been running a stocking rate on the south pasture that her father had considered conservative, and that Denny Crowley, on the one occasion he had driven past and done the mental arithmetic, had considered wasteful. She had been running 31 ewes on 80 acres of her best ground, which is a stocking rate of roughly 0.39 ewes per acre, against the county average of closer to 0.65. She had done this deliberately, based on research from the University of Minnesota Extension Service, showing that moderate stocking rates in variable rainfall years produced better long-term pasture health and better animal performance than aggressive stocking rates, and that the short-term revenue cost of lower stocking density was more than offset by the resilience it created in drought years. Her pastures were stressed in July of 2007. They were not destroyed. Her creek-bottom ground held moisture longer than the upland pastures that most of her neighbors were running. She supplemented with hay beginning in late June, drawn on reserves she had put up herself in the wet spring, and she managed through. Her 2007 lambing results from the previous fall's breeding had been her best yet. A lambing rate of 1.94, 62 lambs weaned from 32 ewes, average weaning weight of 91 pounds. Her gross revenue from those lambs, sold before the drought hit the market, was $14,260 from 32 ewes. Her net per ewe was $289. Denny Crowley's net per ewe in 2007, after the emergency destocking and the hay purchases and the sale discounts, was negative. He did not publish that number, but it was the kind of number that travels in a small county without needing to be published. That fall, Nora's father told her she could decide the rotation for the entire farm, all 320 acres, all 140 of his ewes if she wanted to transition them. He said it over supper on a Wednesday evening in September, and he said it in the same brief, unceremonious way he said everything, and Nora looked at him across the table and she said, "I'll need to call pretty hard." He said, "I know." She said, "It'll take 3 years to get the genetics where they need to be." He said, "I know." He picked up his fork. He said, "You were right." 3 words. For Gunnar Lindgren, that was a speech. Ingrid, at the sink, smiled at the window. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end with a drought and a supper table. In the fall of 2007, Nora began the transition of the Lindgren Farm's full flock to Polypay cross genetics. She culled 60 of her father's ewes over 2 years, not all at once because she understood that the cash flow from the existing flock was what was funding the transition, and she replaced them with animals selected specifically for documented prolificacy, structural soundness, and milk capacity. She adjusted the farm's lambing calendar, the hay program, the creep feeding infrastructure, and the record-keeping system, which had previously existed in Gunner's memory and in a spiral notebook that was not hers to read. She built a new record-keeping system in a binder that she kept on the kitchen shelf next to the cookbooks, and she updated it after every lambing and every sale and every health event, and over time it became the most detailed production record in Fillmore County. By 2009, the full Lindgren flock was running at a lambing rate of 1.81, which was lower than the back 40s peak because the transition animals were not yet fully selected for prolificacy, but which was already 52% above the county average. By 2010, it was 1.89. By 2011, it was 1.96. The net return per ewe in 2011 was $301, against a county average that the State Extension Service estimated at $138. The Lindgren farm was running 140 ewes and producing the net revenue that would have required 305 ewes under the county's standard system. They were doing it on the same 320 acres. They were doing it with one full-time operator, which was Nora, and one part-time operator, which was Gunner, who had not retired so much as redistributed his labor toward the tasks that Nora assigned him, which he performed without complaint and with a competence that she had always known was there. In the fall of 2010, a reporter from the Rochester Post-Bulletin drove out to the Lindgren farm to write a story about the operation. The story ran under the headline, "Harmony Farm Bucks Tradition, Doubles Returns," and it included Nora's per-ewe numbers and a photograph of the south pasture with its lambs, and it was the kind of story that people in Fillmore County read carefully and then set down and picked up again. At the Fillmore County Sheep Producers meeting that November, 3 producers asked Nora if she would be willing to walk them through her genetic selection protocol. She said yes. She spent 2 hours after the meeting at a folding table in the Lutheran church basement, going through her binder with anyone who wanted to look. Denny Crowley was not at that meeting. He had not been at the previous 2 meetings either. This was noticed. He came to the Lindgren farm on a Thursday morning in early December of 2010. Nora was in the barn doing a pre-breeding condition check on the ewes when she heard his truck in the yard. She came out, and he was standing by his truck with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the south pasture, which was empty now with the ewes in the barn, but which he had driven past enough times to know. He said, "I want to talk to you about genetics." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I remember you told me to come back when I had more than 1 ewe and a summer's worth of data." He looked at the ground. He said, "I remember that too." She said, "I've got 140 ewes and 8 years of data." He said, "I know." She said, "Come inside." She put the binder on the kitchen table. She made coffee. She sat across from him and she walked him through every year from 2003 to 2010. The lambing rates and the weaning weights and the per-ewe revenues and the drought year comparison and the stocking rate philosophy and the nutrition protocols and the culling criteria. He asked good questions. She answered them. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. He said, "I lost money in 2007. She said, "I know." He said, "I should have listened to you in 2003. She said, "You didn't have enough information in 2003. I did, but you didn't, and that's a different problem." He looked at her. He said, "That's a generous way to put it." She said, "It's an accurate way to put it. You were working with the information you had. So was I. Mine was just better." He asked if she would help him transition his flock. She said yes, with conditions. The conditions were that he would keep the records she specified, in the format she specified, and that he would not cull animals she told him to keep and not keep animals she told him to cull, and that he would give the transition 3 full years before drawing conclusions. He agreed to all of it. He left 2 hours later with a photocopy of her genetic selection criteria and a list of polypay producers she trusted. Let me tell you about what happened in the years that followed, because the story doesn't end with one man coming around. Between 2010 and 2015, 11 Fillmore County sheep producers transitioned some portion of their flocks to polypay or polypay cross genetics using protocols derived from Nora's system. Not all of them made the full transition. Some ran split flocks for years, testing the new genetics against their existing animals on the same ground, which produced the kind of side-by-side comparisons that are more persuasive than any data table because you can see them with your own eyes. The county's average lambing rate, which had sat at 1.17 to 1.22 for as long as anyone had been keeping records, began to move. By 2013, it was 1.41. By 2015, it was 1.58. These were not Nora's numbers, but they were moving toward Nora's numbers, and the direction of movement was its own kind of verdict. In 2013, Nora was invited to present at the Minnesota Sheep Producers Association annual meeting in St. Cloud. She drove up on a January morning with her binder and her 10 years of production records, and she stood at a podium in a hotel conference room, and she told the story of the back 40 and the $20 ewe and the drought of 2007 and the transition of the Lindgren farm, and she put her numbers on a screen where 200 sheep producers from across the state could see them. The room was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the numbers are not disputable. She said, "The lesson isn't that polypay genetics are magic. They're not. The lesson is that any flock that's optimized for one set of conditions and one set of market assumptions is a flock that needs only one bad year to find out how fragile those assumptions were." The drought of 2007 was Fillmore County's bad year. Every county gets one eventually. The question is whether you've built a system that can survive it. Gunner was in the audience. He had driven up that morning without telling her he was coming. She saw him when she looked up from her notes during the second slide, sitting in the third row with his seed cap in his hands, and she kept talking because she knew that if she stopped talking, she would not be able to start again. When she finished, the room applauded, and Gunner Lindgren stood up, and he was not a man who stood up in rooms. And Nora looked at him from the podium, and she understood that this was the most he was ever going to say about any of it, and it was enough. In 2015, the Minnesota Sheep Producers Association named the Lindgren Farms flock as the highest-performing documented commercial sheep operation in the state, based on a 3-year average lambing rate of 2.03 and a net return per ewe of $318. The award was presented at the annual meeting, and the citation noted that the flock had been built from a foundation that included, among other animals, a Cull Ewe purchased at the Harmony Sale Barn in August of 2003 for $20. Birka had died in the winter of 2009, at 10 years old, which is a long life for a ewe, and her daughters and granddaughters were in the flock when the award was given. Nora kept a photograph of Birka on the shelf in the barn, next to the hook where she hung the lambing flashlight, and she had looked at it every lambing season for 6 years by the time the award came. Let me tell you one last thing, because it matters to how this story ends. In the spring of 2016, Nora's daughter, she'd married a man named Tobias Erickson, who had grown up on a grain farm in Reno County, and who had learned sheep production the way you learn things when you marry into them, which is thoroughly and without the option of stopping. Nora's daughter was 4 years old and not yet relevant to this story, but in the spring of 2022, when she was 10, she came to Nora in the barn during the lambing check, and she had a notebook, a composition notebook with a green cover, and she said, "I've been reading about hair sheep." She said it the way Nora had once said, "I've been reading about prolificacy rates," which is to say, with the particular earnestness of someone who has found a thing that makes sense to them and is not yet sure if anyone else will agree. Nora looked at the notebook. She looked at her daughter. She thought about a kitchen table in June of 2003 and a man who had said, "I need to think about it." And she thought about what it had cost him to say that and what it had cost her to wait. She said, "Tell me what you've learned." And her daughter opened the green notebook and she started talking, and Nora listened the way her father had taught her to listen, which was all the way through, without interrupting, until the other person was finished. Nora Lindgren still farms the 320 acres northeast of Harmony. The binder on the kitchen shelf is the 4th one now. The first 3 having been retired to a box in the closet where she keeps things that matter too much to throw away. The south pasture is still the best ground on the farm, and the lambs on it are still heavier than the lambs on most of the operations that border it, though the gap has narrowed as the county's genetics have improved, which is exactly what she always said she wanted. Berka's photograph is still on the shelf in the barn. The green notebook is on the kitchen table. She bought a Cull Ewe for $20. The county laughed. The drought came. The county's flocks struggled. Her flock stood. And the girl who started with one animal in a back pasture that nobody wanted built the highest performing sheep operation in the state of Minnesota. Not because she was lucky, and not because the conditions were easy, but because she read the data when nobody else was reading it, and she trusted what the data said when nobody else was willing to. That's what happens when the youngest person in the room is the only one who did the reading.